Table 6 is dirty?
Busgirl.
The CEO's daughter snapped at the company dinner. I wiped the mahogany surface with a damp cloth. Then I handed her a heavy black envelope containing the bill. What is this? She scoffed, her voice shrill against the crystal. An eviction notice? I smiled. I bought this venue yesterday. I reserve the right to refuse service to anyone. Get out. The silence that followed was thick and heavy. Brooke's face turned a violent shade of crimson as the Gala music died. The ballroom air felt cold, despite the 300 guests. I watched Robert, the man who fired me after 20 years, sink into his velvet chair. His hands shook as he gripped a crystal tumbler. He finally recognized the man he had discarded like a broken printer. The soft lighting caught the sweat on his forehead. I stood straight, the servant's apron no longer a disguise. The power in the room shifted toward the kitchen doors. My staff stood behind me, their expressions carved from stone. The black envelope remained on the table like a live grenade. Brooke reached for it, her manicured fingers trembling. She looked at the guests who were now recording her with expensive phones. Her digital first reputation was melting under the heat of a dozen camera flashes. I watched her realization dawn like a slow car crash. This was the Marshall Room, the only venue prestigious enough for their merger. Without it, their board would revolt by morning. The smell of expensive perfume suddenly turned sour and stale. You are insane, Stephen, Robert whispered, his voice sounding like dry leaves. I stepped closer, invading the space he had once used to dominate me. I didn't shout because men with real power never have to. I pointed to the security team moving in from the shadows. They were my employees now, paid with the liquidated remains of my severance. The guests began to whisper. A low roar of shifting loyalties. Robert looked at the exit, realizing his limousine was likely already being towed. The walk out would be very long. I leaned down and whispered so only the family could hear. I mentioned the laundry contracts and the catering debts I had quietly assumed. Every vendor in Chicago now answered to my holding company. They were trapped in a city that I had effectively rebuilt around them. Brooke tried to stand, but her knees seemed to give way. The Busgirl comment was a mistake that would cost her the company. I saw the CFO at table 4 raise a glass to me. The betrayal was now complete and absolute. Effective immediately, I said, echoing the words Robert used during my firing. The security guards didn't touch them, but their presence was a physical wall. The elite crowd parted like a dark sea. Brooke began to sob, a high-pitched sound that lacked any real dignity. She looked at her father for a miracle that wasn't coming. Robert looked at the deed on the table and saw his own signature on the debt. He finally understood that I wasn't just a former employee. I was the landlord. The kitchen staff began to clear the plates, ignoring the central drama. They moved with a clinical precision that mocked Brooke's earlier insults. I led the disgraced family toward the service entrance, the path of most humiliation. We passed the dumpsters and the wet pavement of the alleyway. The rain began to fall, turning Brooke's designer dress into a soggy mess. I handed Robert a business card for a bankruptcy attorney I knew. He took it without looking up. The heavy steel door clicked shut with finality. I walked back into the warmth of the golden ballroom. The guests were still there, waiting for the next movement. I took off the black apron and tossed it onto an empty chair. I signaled the band to play something classic and loud. My staff brought out the vintage scotch I had hidden in the cellar. The night was no longer a corporate gala for a dying firm. It was the launch of my new empire. I sat at table 6 and began to eat. The steak was perfectly medium rare. The celebration inside the ballroom felt hollow despite the vintage scotch. I watched the guests mingle, their eyes darting toward the empty seat at table 6. They were terrified that the hospitality monster I created might turn on them next. I stood by the oak bar, feeling the cold weight of the building in my bones. My phone buzzed in my pocket with a single, encrypted message from Sarah. The takeover was proceeding, but the bank had found a hidden liability. a shadow moved near the velvet curtains. I walked toward the manager's office to find a quiet space. The hallway smelled of old wax and the ozone scent of a coming storm. My objective was simple: finalize the acquisition of the firm's main supply line before midnight. If I missed the wire window, Robert might find a way to stall the bankruptcy. I opened the heavy door and saw a man standing by my desk. It was Marcus, the former CFO who had toasted me earlier. He wasn't smiling anymore. He looked like he had seen a ghost. "The board is blocking the sale of the laundry division," Marcus said quietly. He held a crumpled printout showing a series of late-hour injunctions. Robert had managed to find a judge who still owed him a favor from the old days. This was the primary obstacle I hadn't expected. If they held the supply lines, they could starve my new venues of essential services. I felt the familiar burn of adrenaline behind my eyes. I sat down and opened my laptop, the screen illuminating my face. "They think they can choke me out," I muttered, typing a series of commands. Marcus leaned over the desk, his breath smelling of expensive cigars and desperation. He told me that Brooke hadn't gone home to cry. She was at the firm's data center, trying to wipe the server logs. If she succeeded, the evidence of her incompetence would vanish into digital thin air. I looked at the security feed of the hallway. The pressure was mounting as the clock ticked toward midnight. I needed a new plan immediately. I pulled up the Marshall Room's original deed from the safe. Hidden in the sub-basement blueprints was a detail Robert had completely overlooked during the sale. The building shared a fiber optic hub with the firm's headquarters next door. I owned the physical ground that their data traveled across. I realized I didn't need their permission to access the servers. I just needed to cut the power to their cooling systems from my basement. This was the mid-scene turn I needed to win. "Stay here and watch the door," I told Marcus, grabbing a heavy flashlight. I headed for the service stairs, my boots echoing on the concrete steps. The air grew damp and tasted of iron as I descended into the bowels of the building. I found the main breaker panel behind a rusted cage of copper wires. The labels were written in fading ink from the 1960s. I located the bypass switch for the neighbor's cooling grid. My hand hovered over the lever, ready to melt their hard drives. A loud crash echoed from the top of the stairs above me. I killed the flashlight and pressed my back against the cold brick wall. Someone was moving in the dark, their footsteps heavy and uneven. I heard the rasp of a familiar, gravelly voice calling my name. It was Robert, and he didn't sound like a man who was ready to quit. He was down here in the dark, looking for the same switch. The power balance was shifting in the blackness. I waited for him to get closer. "I know you are here, Stephen," Robert croaked, his voice bouncing off the low ceiling. I stepped out of the shadows, the beam of my light hitting his eyes. He looked haggard, his silk tie loosened, and his expensive coat stained with soot. He held a small, silver lighter that flickered in the drafty room. He told me he would burn the building down before he let me have the servers. I saw the desperation in his gaze. He had nothing left to lose but his pride. I didn't argue with him or try to play the hero. I simply pointed the light at the gas main behind his head. We stood there in the silence of the basement, two men trapped by their own history. The clock on my wrist chirped, signaling that the wire window had officially closed. I had missed the deadline to buy the supply lines. Robert started to laugh, a dry and haunting sound in the dark. But then my phone buzzed with a notification. Brooke had just been arrested at the data center. The flash of my phone screen cut through the basement gloom. Brooke's arrest for corporate espionage changed everything, yet the wire window for the supply lines had shut. Robert stared at the notification, his lighter flickering near the gas main. My primary objective was now to force a physical surrender of his remaining shares. He was cornered, but the smell of gas was getting stronger in the cramped space. I saw a leak in the rusted pipe behind his shoulder. One spark would finish us both. "She was always sloppy," I said, my voice steady despite the rising fumes. Robert's hand trembled, the small flame dancing dangerously close to the venting gas. He didn't care about the arrest or the company anymore. He wanted to see me burn in the house I had stolen from him. The pressure in the room felt physical, a weight pressing against my chest. I realized I couldn't move toward him without triggering a panicked reaction. We were two ghosts haunting a graveyard of bad debts and broken promises. Suddenly, a heavy thud echoed through the floorboards above us. Marcus was supposed to be guarding the door, but the sound was too rhythmic for a struggle. I realized the building's old pneumatic system was cycling back on. The pressure shift caused the gas leak to hiss with renewed intensity. Robert flinched, dropping the lighter onto the damp concrete floor. It didn't go out. It skittered toward a pool of standing water near the electrical panel. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. I lunged for the lighter, my fingers scraping the cold floor. I caught it just inches from a sparking wire. Robert slumped against the brick wall, the fight finally leaving his eyes. He looked at the gas main and let out a jagged laugh. "You won, Stephen," he whispered, his head leaning back into the shadows. I stood up and pocketed the silver lighter. The mid-scene turn wasn't just his surrender. It was the realization that he had actually sabotaged the system years ago. I saw the manual override valve painted a bright, peeling red. It was locked with a heavy chain that looked relatively new. Robert hadn't just come down here to blow the building up. He had come here to ensure no one could ever restart the cooling grid. I realized the servers weren't just at risk from heat. They were already being flooded by the basement's ancient drainage system. The power balance shifted as I saw the water rising around our ankles. The digital evidence was drowning. The logs? I snapped, grabbing Robert by his damp lapels. He didn't move or resist my grip. He just stared at the rising water with a vacant expression. I needed to get to the server room upstairs before the short circuit destroyed the drives. My objective had shifted from financial takeover to historical preservation. Without those files, I could never prove the depth of Brooks' fraud. I pushed Robert toward the stairs, forcing him to move. We waded through the murky, cold water together. We reached the service door just as the lights flickered and died. The building plunged into a total, suffocating darkness. I felt for the handle, but it was jammed from the other side. Someone had locked us in the sub-basement. Marcus was no longer responding to my shouts through the door. The primary obstacle was now a locked steel plate between us and survival. The water reached our knees, smelling of oil and ancient Chicago mud. I kicked the door with everything I had left. A muffled voice came through the steel, cold and unfamiliar. It wasn't Marcus or a disgruntled employee. It was Sarah's voice, but she sounded different. She told me the shares had already been transferred to a third party. I realized then that my lawyer had been playing her own game. She hadn't been working for me or Robert. She was the one who triggered the arrest to clear the board. The power I thought I held was just a temporary illusion. We were trapped. I looked at Robert, who was smiling in the dark. He knew Sarah better than I did, apparently. She was the final complication I never saw coming. The water continued to rise, and the air was thick with the scent of the gas leak. I pulled the silver lighter from my pocket and looked at the flame. It was the only light left in the room. I had the venue, but Sarah had the company. The game was far from over. I heard a key turn. The steel door groaned as Sarah pulled it open from the outside. Her face remained a mask of professional indifference under the dim emergency lights. "You were never supposed to be down here, Stephen," she said. Her voice lacked the warmth of our 5-year history. I dragged Robert out of the rising flood, his shoes splashing in the oily muck. My objective was simple. I had to secure the digital drive before Sarah's new masters wiped the evidence. The water behind us continued to hiss. We climbed the concrete stairs toward the server room. Sarah walked ahead, her heels clicking a rhythmic, predatory beat on the stone. My primary obstacle wasn't the lock, but the fact that Sarah knew my every tactical move. She had helped me draft the very acquisition strategy she was now subverting. The pressure in my chest intensified as we reached the second floor. The scent of ozone and scorched plastic hung in the air. The server room door stood ajar, glowing with a soft blue light. I pushed past her, expecting to see a technician at the consoles. Instead, the room was empty. The server racks hummed, their cooling fans struggling against the humid heat of the building. I saw a black USB drive blinking in the master port. This was the mid-scene turn I needed. Someone was already downloading the fraud logs, and they weren't finished yet. I moved toward the terminal, my hand reaching for the plastic casing. Sarah didn't try to stop me. She just smiled. "You think you found the prize?" Sarah said, leaning against the doorframe. I grabbed the drive, but the data light stayed solid. The transfer was frozen at 99%. The power balance shifted as I realized the system required a physical biometric key to complete. Robert stumbled into the room, gasping for air. He looked at the screen and then at his own trembling hands. He held the only thumbprint that could unlock the final encryption. We needed his cooperation to win the war. I grabbed Robert's hand and forced it toward the scanner. He pulled back, his eyes wide with a sudden, sharp clarity. "She promised me immunity," he whispered, looking at Sarah. My stomach dropped. The betrayal was deeper than a simple property theft. Robert had traded his own daughter's freedom to save his personal estate from the bank. Sarah wasn't working for a third party. She was working for Robert all along. The eviction at the Gala had been a staged distraction for the board. I looked at the drive in my hand, then at the man I once respected. Robert placed his thumb on the glass, and the light turned green. The download completed with a sharp, digital chime. I had the evidence, but it was useless if Robert was protected by a secret deal. I realized the supply lines weren't blocked by a judge. They were being sold to a shell company owned by Sarah herself. The complication was staggering. I was holding a weapon that had no firing pin. "Give me the drive, Stephen," Sarah demanded, holding out a pale hand. I stepped back, my heels hitting the edge of a server rack. The hum of the machines felt like a physical vibration in my teeth. I looked at the exit, but Marcus appeared in the doorway behind Sarah. He wasn't a hostage or a victim. He was holding a heavy master key and a tablet. The team had been complete without me. I was the only one who didn't know the real plan. I gripped the black drive until the plastic edges bit into my palm. I had the venue, but they had the entire industry's infrastructure. The Gala wasn't the end of their reign. It was the birth of a leaner, more vicious entity. I looked at Marcus, searching for any sign of the man who toasted me. He only looked at the drive. I realized then that my loyal staff had also been bought. The loyalty I felt was a manufactured product. The room felt smaller. The Gala was just a dress rehearsal, Marcus said, stepping into the blue light. He took the tablet and swiped a command that locked the server room from the inside. I was trapped in a room with 3 traitors and a useless piece of plastic. My objective shifted from acquisition to survival. I looked at the glass wall of the server room. The drop to the ballroom floor was 20 feet. I checked the weight of the drive. The micro twist was just beginning. I gripped the black drive as the server room became a cage. Sarah and Marcus stood like twin sentinels by the door. My objective was simple: escape with the logs before they took the drive by force. The primary obstacle was the reinforced glass wall and the 3 traitors blocking the only exit. The humming fans sounded like a countdown. Robert watched from the corner, his eyes vacant and hollow. I backed toward the server rack, my boots crunching on a loose screw. "Don't be a hero, Stephen," Marcus said, his voice flat. He held the master key like a weapon. I looked at the heavy fire extinguisher mounted near the glass. The pressure in the room was stifling as Sarah took a predatory step forward. She didn't want to fight. She wanted the digital evidence of her double cross. I felt the vibration of the cooling system beneath my feet. The air smelled of hot plastic and sweat. My fingers tightened around the metal extinguisher bracket. I swung the red canister with everything I had left. The glass wall didn't shatter, its spider webbed into 1,000 white fractures. This was the mid-scene turn I needed. The impact triggered the room's emergency fire suppression system. A thick, white cloud of halon gas hissed from the ceiling. Sarah screamed, covering her face as the oxygen began to thin. The power balance shifted in the fog. I couldn't see them, but I knew the layout by heart. I kicked the weakened glass until a jagged hole appeared. I scrambled through the opening, falling onto the dark ballroom balcony. The halon gas followed me like a ghost. Below, the guests were gone, leaving behind a graveyard of half-eaten dinners. My lungs burned as I fought for a clean breath of air. I looked back and saw a shadow emerging from the fog. It was Marcus, his face masked by a white service cloth. He was still coming for me. I ran along the velvet-lined railing toward the grand staircase. My knees buckled from the earlier basement climb, but I didn't stop. I needed to reach the lobby and the security detail I actually trusted. The primary pressure was the fading light as the building's backup power failed. I reached the stairs and slid down the banister to save time. The drive was tucked securely into my inner pocket. I could hear Marcus's heavy boots hitting the balcony above me. "Miguel?" I shouted into the empty lobby, my voice echoing. No one answered my call. The grand entrance was locked tight with heavy chains I didn't recognize. I realized then that the security I hired had been replaced hours ago. Every exit was a dead end designed by Sarah's meticulous hand. I was trapped in my own palace with a hunter on my heels. I turned toward the kitchen, the only place with a service lift. I needed a new escape. I burst through the swinging doors into the stainless steel silence. The kitchen was a maze of sharp corners and hanging copper pots. I found the service lift, but the call button was dead. I had to climb the greasy cables to reach the roof. The obstacle was my own physical exhaustion and the darkness. I grabbed the heavy lift cable, the steel biting into my palms. I began to pull myself up into the narrow, dark shaft. My muscles screamed. Halfway up, the lift cable jerked violently beneath my weight. Someone was pulling the manual crank from the basement level below me. I looked down into the black pit and saw a flickering light. It was the silver lighter Robert had dropped in the flood. He was down there, working the gears with a madman's strength. The drive in my pocket felt like a lead weight. I realized Robert wasn't helping Sarah anymore. He wanted to drop me into the pit. I reached the roof hatch just as the cable snapped. I rolled onto the wet gravel, gasping for the cold Chicago air. The city lights twinkled in the distance, indifferent to my struggle. I stood up and looked at the black drive in my hand. It was cracked from the fall through the server glass. I didn't know if the data was still intact. Then I saw a helicopter landing on the nearby helipad. It wasn't a rescue. It was Brooke. The helicopter blades whipped the wet gravel against my face as Brooke stepped onto the roof. She looked different, stripped of her corporate blazer and wearing a flight suit that suggested a planned escape. My objective was to keep the cracked drive out of her hands while finding a way off this ledge. The primary obstacle was the sheer drop behind me and the pilot now exiting the cockpit with a heavy taser. I gripped the plastic drive tightly, feeling the sharp edges. Brooke didn't look angry, she looked like a hunter who had already won. "Give it to me, Steven." Brooke shouted over the deafening roar of the rotors. I stepped back, my heels reaching the very edge of the stone parapet. The city of Chicago stretched out below us, a glittering trap of light and cold steel. The pressure in my chest was a physical weight as the pilot moved to my left side. I looked at the drive and realized the casing was leaking a strange, dark fluid. It wasn't just a storage device, it contained a chemical fail-safe. Sarah had poisoned the prize to ensure no one could ever use it. The pilot lunged, but I dodged toward the helicopter's tail rotor. This was the scene turn I had prayed for during the climb. The wind from the blades blew the dark fluid from the drive onto Brooke's expensive flight suit. She screamed as the liquid began to smoke, reacting with the synthetic fabric of her gear. The power balance shifted instantly as the pilot turned to help her. I realized the fluid was a highly corrosive acid designed to destroy the internal chips. My hands were already beginning to sting. I had to drop the evidence to survive. I tossed the smoking drive into the spinning tail rotors with a desperate grunt. The plastic shattered into a million black shards, scattered by the wind into the dark abyss below. Brooke reached out, her fingers clawing at the empty air as her leverage vanished. The pilot struggled to unzip her smoking suit before the chemical reached her skin. I saw my chance and ran toward the roof access door I had just exited. The door swung open, but it wasn't Marcus or Sarah. It was Miguel, holding a heavy iron kitchen skillet. "Get in, boss," Miguel hissed, his eyes wide with a mix of fear and adrenaline. He hadn't been bought by Sarah. He had been hiding in the ventilation shafts. We slammed the heavy door shut and jammed the bolt with the iron handle. The sound of Brooke's muffled screams and the helicopter's roar faded behind the steel. My hands were red and blistered from the acid, but the pain felt like life. Miguel told me the police were finally at the front gates. We had to reach the lobby to survive. We descended the stairs, our shadows flickering against the peeling paint of the service well. Miguel explained that Sarah had redirected the police to the wrong address earlier that night. She had used my own encrypted communications to mislead the authorities while she purged the building. The primary pressure was the realization that the police outside might not be here to help me. They might be here to arrest the man who stole a Gala. I checked my pockets for any remaining leverage. I found only the silver lighter Robert had dropped. The lobby was a forest of flashlights and heavy tactical gear as we reached the ground. I held my blistered hands high, showing my palms to the approaching officers in the dark. The primary obstacle was the lieutenant who stepped forward, holding a warrant for my arrest. He claimed I had kidnapped Robert in the basement during the flood. I looked at Miguel, but he was already being forced against the marble wall. Sarah stood behind the police line, looking like a concerned citizen. She had managed to flip the entire narrative against me. "He's in the basement," I shouted, pointing toward the service elevator. The lieutenant didn't move, his face a mask of cold, professional duty. He told me Robert had already been found and had made a full statement. The scene turn hit me like a physical blow to the stomach. Robert wasn't a victim or a conspirator, he was the one who called the police on me. He had used the flood as a cover to frame me for his own corporate crimes. I was the fall man for 20 years of his bad decisions. The officers ratcheted the zip ties around my swollen, burned wrists. The pain was nearly unbearable, but I kept my eyes on Sarah's calm face. She leaned in close, her breath smelling of peppermint and cold ambition. She whispered that the supply lines were already liquidated into an offshore account in my name. I realized the final complication was a digital paper trail that made me the thief. I had the venue, but I was going to prison for the rest of the empire. Sarah had won the long game by making me the owner. They led me toward the squad car, the rain cooling the fire on my skin. I looked back at the marshal room, its golden lights reflecting in the puddles. The building I fought for was now a tomb for my reputation and my future. Brooke was being treated by medics near the helicopter, her face hidden by a blanket. Robert stood by the gates, watching me with a look of pure, unadulterated triumph. He had traded his daughter's reputation to clear his own debt. I felt a cold laughter bubbling in my chest. As the officer pushed my head down into the car, I felt something in the seat. It was a small, plastic card tucked into the crevice of the upholstery. I moved my tied hands to touch the smooth surface of the hidden object. It was a guest badge from the Gala, but the name on it was Marcus. The micro, twist was a realization that Marcus was still playing a deeper game than Sarah. He had left me a trail, even while pretending to be a traitor. I felt the card's edge, realizing it was actually a disguised memory chip. The car door slammed, cutting off the sound of the rain and the sirens. I sat in the darkness, my heart hammering against my ribs in the quiet. I had to get this chip to a safe terminal before the police processed my property. The objective was no longer to win the industry, but to survive the night. I looked out the window at Marcus, who was standing alone by the service entrance. He gave a single, almost imperceptible nod before turning away. He was the only one who knew I had the real logs. The squad car pulled away from the curb, leaving the marshal room behind us. I looked at the blisters on my hands, the red skin peeling in the dim light. The pain was a reminder that I was still in the fight, however desperate. I shifted my weight, hiding the small chip deep within the lining of my trousers. The journey to the station would be the longest ride of my life. I closed my eyes and began to plan my next move. The war was moving to a different room. My objective was to hide the chip Marcus left behind before the booking officer searched me. The primary obstacle was my zip-tied hands, which remained swollen and raw from the acid burns. Every movement sent a jolt of white, hot pain through my shoulders. I felt the small plastic card shifting against my leg. The officer in the front seat watched me through the rearview mirror. His eyes were cold and suspicious. I had only minutes before we reached the station. I shifted my hips to drive the chip deeper into the upholstery. The thick fabric of the seat offered a slim chance for concealment. The pressure increased when the driver took a sharp turn, nearly throwing me against the door. I gritted my teeth against the agony in my burned palms. I needed to ensure the data survived even if I was locked away. If Robert's influence reached the precinct, this evidence was my only shield. I felt the edge of the chip slide into a seam. The car slowed down as we arrived. The iron gates of the precinct opened with a mechanical groan. This was the mid-scene turn I didn't expect. The officer who opened my door wasn't wearing a standard uniform. He wore a tactical vest with a private security logo I recognized from the marshal room. The power balance shifted as I realized the police hadn't arrested me at all. I was being delivered to a private holding facility owned by Sarah's shell company. The arrest was a kidnapping designed to bypass the legal system entirely. Robert was far more desperate than I had initially thought. They dragged me into a windowless room that smelled of industrial bleach. The primary pressure was the realization that no one knew where I was. I was officially a missing person in the eyes of the law. Sarah entered the room, her silhouette sharp against the bright fluorescent lights. She didn't carry a briefcase this time, she held a digital tablet and a syringe. She wanted the location of the backup server I had mentioned in the basement. I looked at her and felt a surge of cold, focused hatred. The war was personal. "Where is the physical mirror, Stephen?" Sarah asked, her voice like ice. I refused to speak, focusing on the rhythmic throb of my pulse. The primary obstacle was the physical interrogation she was clearly prepared to start. She mentioned Brooke's recovery and how the acid had scarred her face permanently. Robert wanted blood for his daughter's beauty, and Sarah was happy to provide it. She stepped closer, the needle gleaming under the harsh light. I looked for a way to use my bound hands. I felt the silver lighter still in my pocket. I leaned back, using the chair to mask the movement of my fingers. I managed to flip the lid of the lighter with a metallic click. The mid-scene turn was the hidden compartment I had built into the casing years ago. It contained a high-frequency transmitter designed for emergency distress calls at the hotels. I pressed the small button, hoping the signal could pierce the shielded walls of this bunker. Sarah noticed the faint blue glow coming from my trouser pocket. She lunged for the device. Her face twisted in a snarl. I didn't move away. The room's door burst open before Sarah could grab the transmitter. A team of federal agents in windbreakers stormed the small space with weapons drawn. The power balance shifted for the final time that night. Marcus had been working with the FBI for months to bring down Robert's empire. The chip he left in the car was a tracker, not just a data drive. Sarah dropped the syringe, her hands rising in a slow, defeated motion. I felt the tension in my chest finally snap. The long game was coming to an end. They cut my zip ties and treated my burns with cool, soothing gel. The objective shifted to the formal deposition against Robert and his daughter. The primary obstacle was the complex web of offshore accounts Sarah had created in my name. I had to walk the agents through every transaction to prove my innocence. We spent hours in the federal building, the sun beginning to rise over the lake. Marcus sat across from me, sipping bitter coffee. He apologized for the deception, but it was necessary to catch them all. The micro twist came when Marcus handed me a final document to sign. It wasn't a confession or a waiver of my rights. It was a deed of transfer for the firm's entire catering and supply division. Because I was the primary creditor, the federal seizure allowed me to buy the assets for pennies. Robert had essentially funded my takeover with his own stolen money. I looked at the paper and realized I now owned the very air they breathed. The empire was officially mine. I signed my name with a steady hand. I walked out of the federal building into the crisp morning air. The city looked different in the light of the new day. My hands were heavily bandaged, but the pain was manageable now. I saw a black car waiting for me at the curb. Miguel was behind the wheel, a wide grin on his tired face. We drove back toward the Marshall room one last time. The objective was to reopen the venue under my own banner. The era of the Busgirl and the analog man was over. The Marshall room stood silent and majestic in the early light. I walked through the grand entrance, my footsteps echoing on the polished marble. The objective was to erase the last traces of the Gala disaster. I saw a maintenance crew already working on the broken server glass upstairs. The primary pressure of the night had vanished, replaced by a sense of duty. I was the steward of this place now. I walked into the kitchen and saw the staff waiting for me. They stood in a quiet line. Miguel handed me a fresh white apron, clean and perfectly pressed. I looked at my reflection in the stainless steel prep table. The man looking back was tired, but his eyes were clear and sharp. I had resolved the lie that my value was tied to a title. My value was the respect of the people standing in this room. I tied the apron over my suit, a symbol of my new leadership. We had a breakfast service to prepare for the city's homeless shelters. This was the new standard. I looked at the silver lighter on the counter, its flame extinguished. Robert and Brooke were in federal custody, their names erased from the industry. Sarah was facing a decade of prison for kidnapping and fraud. The war was won, but the work was just beginning. I walked toward the stove and lit the first burner. The blue flame hissed to life, a small spark in the vast kitchen. I looked at Miguel and nodded. "Let's get to work," I said. The truth was finally in the room. The industrial stove hissed as the pilot lights flickered. My burned palms throbbed beneath the white bandages, a constant reminder of the night's fire. I had one final objective: scrub the last traces of Robert's influence from the Marshall room's books. The federal agents were gone, but the physical ledger in the basement safe remained. I needed to destroy it before the morning light revealed my own fingerprints. I walked down the service stairs, my boots heavy on the damp stone. The air smelled of iron. The basement door was still warped from the flood. I pushed it open, seeing the water line stained onto the brick walls. The safe was tucked behind a false panel in the electrical room. My primary obstacle appeared as a faint, rhythmic scratching sound from the ventilation duct. Someone was still inside the building, hidden in the narrow shafts. I froze, my hand hovering over the cold dial of the safe. The silence was brittle. I realized I was not as alone as I thought. A shadow detached itself from the ceiling as I turned. It was Brooke, her face swathed in thick, white medical gauze. She had escaped the hospital to find the same ledger I sought. Her eyes were wide, and filled with a frantic, desperate energy. She held a heavy brass paperweight like a weapon. The power balance shifted as she lunged toward the safe. I moved to block her, my injured hands screaming in protest. We were two ghosts fighting over the bones of a dead firm. "It's over, Brooke," I said, my voice echoing in the small room. She didn't speak, her breathing was a jagged rasp behind the bandages. She swung the brass weight, clipping my shoulder with a dull thud. I realized she wasn't looking for money. She was looking for the original employment contracts that proved her father's negligence. She wanted to burn him to save herself from the espionage charges. I saw a small, hidden key taped to the back of the ledger. It was a new detail. The key belonged to a private locker at the Union Station. I realized Robert had a second set of logs he never told Sarah about. The mid-scene turn revealed a deeper layer of fraud that could dismantle the entire industry. Brooke reached for the key, but I caught her wrist. We struggled in the dark, our shadows dancing against the wet brick. I felt the paperweight slip from her hand. It hit the floor with a metallic clang. The fight died out of her instantly. I held the small key against the dim light. Brooke slumped into the corner, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. She was no longer the visionary CEO or the cruel daughter. She was just a broken girl in a ruined building. I looked at the ledger and realized the lie was finally dead. My value was never about owning the venue. It was about surviving the people who tried to steal it. I pocketed the key and offered her my bandaged hand. She refused it. The morning sun began to bleed through the high foyer windows. I walked Brooke to the front entrance where the real police waited. The objective was completed, but the victory felt like cold ash. Marcus stood by the gate, watching as they led her away. He told me the Union Station locker was already being searched. The truth was out, and the industry would never be the same. I felt a strange sense of peace. The Marshall room was finally quiet and still. I sat on the grand staircase and watched the light move. The twist came when Miguel handed me a letter found in the mail slot. It was an anonymous thank you note from the board members I had humiliated. They were grateful I had exposed the rot before the merger collapsed. I realized I didn't just win, I had been the architect of their salvation. I looked at my hands and began to unwrap the bandages. The skin was healing. I was ready to lead,